Well, welcome everybody. I'm so glad you can make it today to see the walkthrough for Forms of Identity, Women Artists in the 90s. I'm the assistant curator here at the museum, Alyssa Cordova. And I thought maybe I'd start with just first letting you know that this museum does have a rich history of supporting women in the arts. It's actually started by 13 pioneer women and opened when it opened its doors in 1962. And we've gone on to have a history of many solo exhibitions for women artists such as Rachel Lacowitz, Mary Howman, Catherine Opie, and recently Marilyn Minter. So it goes without saying then that we have some wonderful pieces in our collection here. We have a permanent collection of about 3,300 objects, and many of those works are created by some pioneer women artists. And I thought first I'd also start with a little background about myself. So my background is an artist. I studied sculpture as an undergrad, and so I still kind of consider myself an artist turned curator. And after I graduated, I started an independent curating group called Six Pack Projects with 5 other artists / curators in where we would curate shows throughout the LA and Orange County area in unconventional spaces like vacant retail spaces or other museums or galleries. And so when I came to the museum 3 years ago, starting to curate in the permanent collection was sort of a new venture for me. But it's a really interesting way to curate an exhibition. I think it's really unique because it allows you the opportunity to look at these objects in a way historically that you might not necessarily think about if they weren't in relationship to one another in the collection. So, Forms of Identity, Women Artists in the 90s, I sort of got the idea from this actually. The evolution of the idea for this exhibition started with fashion, funny enough. I started reading about this movement in fashion that was born out of 80s and the punk music scene called post-constructivism. And a lot of these women fashion designers were starting to put together garments that were hand-sewn, where they were mixing patterns and colors and layering materials like plastic and wool together to create these almost more like sculptural forms as much as they were fashion objects. And that got me thinking, well, if fashion designers were working in that way, what were fine artists, women artists doing in the 90s? Were they doing anything similar? Was there any relationship to the way that they were creating these forms? So that kind of led me down this rabbit hole of really looking at artists in the 90s and looking at our collection and seeing what works and what artists sort of stood out in that vein, these forms and these structures that they were creating. And within that, really studying what was happening in prior art movements, women's art movements, specifically feminism, and what was happening with feminist artists in the 70s, 80s, and into the 90s, and that progression into what some people call third wave feminism in the 90s, where the prior work that other artists had done in political activism that other women artists had done in the 70s and 80s sort of allowed for the opportunity for artists working in the 90s to kind of create work either separate from that or kind of as a result of that. And kind of perhaps they didn't have the pressure so much to be as people as going that way. So. First, I want to also mention that the artists that I've selected kind of fall into these 4 general categories of this idea of identity. So there's artists, and they overlap as well, so they're not meant to be completely restricted. You can kind of, they're open to interpretation as well, but sort of there's some artists that are looking at identity in terms of their own personal identity in the inner world and exploring that, the idea of the personal becoming political. There's also artists that were sort of working specifically with the certain materials and the formal properties of art making and creating works with materials that they may have new freedoms with that prior they may not have necessarily had those opportunities to work with and create works. And then you also had artists who are commenting about femininity in general, looking at the ways that the coding of certain types of materials and the way that women were working with those materials in the 90s. And also finally the idea too of sexuality and gender identity as well, and those kind of subcultures within the umbrella of womanhood in general. So first I'd like to take you over to look at this piece behind you, but be careful also where you step. This is a piece called Homage to Carl Andre by the artist Rachel Lakowitz. I should also mention too that all of these artists have either worked or lived in the LA area. There's a strong connection to California and the Los Angeles area. Rachel Lakowitz is a Los Angeles-based artist. I think with the exception of 3 artists, all of the other artists are living and are working in the area still to this day. So Rachel Lakowitz created this piece called Homage to Carl Andre, and this is made out of lipstick and wax. And what she's done is she's taken a material that we typically might define as feminine, and she's recontextualized it to create this floor piece, which is fashioned after the male minimalist artist Carl Andre's floor pieces, which are typically made out of stone or concrete, those types of materials. In a way, it's almost like she's shifting power back towards women artists by using a material that she's taken that idea and reappropriated that material to women artists. And then I'm going to take you into this gallery to see more. And as we look at the works, if you have questions, you're welcome to ask questions. This is kind of a big group, so maybe I will have you just look at this piece and then we'll move into the bigger areas. So as you enter, take a few moments to look at this piece here by Alexis Smith, and then I'll talk about it. I'll meet you back over here. This is a great turnout.
We heard you were talking.
All right, so if I could bring everybody in, you can get cozy in the big group. You can be mindful of where you're standing, that I move in here.
Was there a special reason to be on the floor?
Well, it's because it's in direct correlation to the Carl Andre pieces that in his works are directly on the floor. That piece, the original intention was for it to lay on the actual floor, but because of security reasons, we had to create a pedestal for it. But in his pieces, they have work, for instance, by him at SF MoMA. You can actually walk directly on his works.
So what is his work made out of?
His is typically made out of cement or stone. So, the piece that you saw as you were entering is a collage assemblage work by LA-based artist Alexis Smith. And I had a chance to talk with her at the opening, and she said, really, the interpretation of the piece is meant to be open-ended. It's kind of what you read into it. There's an element of humor to her work as well that's pretty prevalent. Her background is in writing, and so there's also this relationship between language and imagery. But I kind of think of her work as almost a mirror reflecting back onto us what is happening in terms of popular culture and what we kind of, the humor in that, and maybe even a little bit of the irony in that as well. And so now you're standing in this gallery, and there's this idea, as I mentioned before, the personal becoming political. So many of these artists were really unpacking unpacking their own memories and personal experiences to create works that were much more personal and individualized than perhaps some of the prior more political works that were being created. So if you look behind you here, this is an installation piece by LA artist Liz Craft. It's called Hideout, and she patterned this piece after the exact dimensions of her graduate studio when she was a student there at UCLA. And this idea, you can walk all the way around it, and this is the idea of the privatization of a personal space. And also, there's an element to this piece where it can be completely folded down and compacted, and all of the components fit into that metal box there. What's interesting about this work is that though there is a door and though there are windows, you really can't enter the space. That inner space has become sort of sacred and protected. And I also noticed with some of these artists working in the 90s too, that decade, the 90s, was really a time period where technology was beginning to explode, but it hadn't quite reached the level that we know today in terms of how we communicate and kind of the globalization of how we communicate. So I think also what was happening at that time with some artists was they were really grappling with this increased encroaching upon their personal space. And so there's this idea of this, especially with technology, how our private worlds are increasingly being encroached upon. And so I think this piece also physically, as you walk around it, it sort of has that feeling too. And then kind of in that same vein, in terms of the personal, is the LA-based artist China Craft. She's considers herself a conceptual artist. And this piece here is called Box Number 6. From the official Stitch and Hide Procedure series. So what the story behind this work is, and there's about 30 works that are in similar size and shape as this work we have in our collection. This is the only piece we have, but other institutions have other works. What she did was, in 1995, she decided, through an official scientific analysis of her personal possessions, she decided that 77.13% of all of the objects that she owned in her life were burdensome to her. They were official burden status. So she decided, and there is that's humorous, and she had her studies and analysis officially documented by the state of California in these notarized documents of their official burden status. And then what she did was she proceeded to take those objects and transform them into soft sculptures and objects. So I'm not really certain what those objects are. It's meant to be sort of mysterious, but also it's kind of fun to guess what they could be. Hopefully nothing organic. That would be difficult for our conservationists, but also getting to that idea too of taking a closer look at these artists taking a closer look at their own personal lives and kind of reevaluating that and analyzing that a little more closely.
Is there one object per bundle, or are there lots of objects inside a bundle?
That's a good question. I don't know. I tried to ask, she was at the opening, and I tried to ask her, but she was purposely mysterious about it. Because the idea is that these have been transformed. They're not old plates or dishes or Tupperware. They are now sculptures. They're now mysterious soft sculptures.
Did you ask her if she was relieved by being unburdened?
No, I didn't. But she literally did turn all of them into sculptures. And I think, did she study under you, Jackie? She had mentioned that she was one of your students.
She started this series in a class that I was teaching at UCLA. Yeah, she would bundle her things up and make these forms that sort of fit them and started sewing them. So she started the whole process as a student at UCLA.
She was a young woman.
Yeah.
So there actually are things.
Yeah. Her possessions are in there.
And And Jackie's one of the artists in the exhibition. We'll be hearing from her later about her work. I'm going to take you back through this gallery.